The Pentagon announcing another U.S. strike on an alleged drug trafficking boat decimated off the coast of Venezuela.
We have a lot of drugs pouring into our country, coming in for a long time. And these came out of Venezuela. We took it out.
September 2nd, 2025. A small speedboat leaves a Venezuelan port. 11 men are aboard. Within minutes, an American missile turns it into a fireball. 2 survivors cling to the burning wreckage. Then the order comes down from Washington: kill everybody. And this is how U.S. Delta Force is rapidly killing cartel networks.
Tonight, President Trump's war on drugs potentially expanding after U.S. strikes on alleged drug boats near Venezuela. The Trump administration has now begun detailed planning to send U.S. troops and intelligence officers to Mexico.
For 40 years, the war on drugs was a paperwork war. DEA agents made cases, prosecutors filed indictments, Coast Guard cutters chased smugglers and pulled them onto boats in handcuffs. Even when special forces got involved, and they did, all the way back to the Pablo Escobar manhunt in Colombia, the rule was the same. You don't shoot drug traffickers, you arrest them. That rule died on January 20th, 2025.
Under the orders I signed today, we will also be designating the cartels as foreign terrorist organizations.
Hours after Donald Trump was sworn in for a second term, he signed an executive order with a quiet little number, 14157, and a not-so-quiet title, designating cartels and other organizations as foreign terrorist organizations. The text didn't read like a policy memo. It read like a war declaration. The cartels, it said, function as quasi-governmental entities running a campaign of assassination, terror, rape, and brute force. A reporter asked Trump that afternoon if he was thinking about sending special operations forces into Mexico. Trump didn't blink. By February 20th, the State Department had formally designated 8 groups as foreign terrorist organizations: the Sinaloa Cartel, CJNG, the Northeast Cartel, the Gulf Cartel, La Nueva Familia Michoacana, Carteles Unidos, MS-13, and the Venezuelan prison gang Tren de Aragua. Within months, the Cartel of the Suns, the alleged drug network run out of Maduro's own government, would join the list. Then Colombia's Clan del Golfo, then a couple of Haitian gangs for good measure. But the legal label was just paperwork. The real shift was happening behind closed doors at the Justice Department. In early February, Acting Deputy Attorney General Emile Bove pulled the agency's top drug prosecutors into a room and told them, according to 3 people who were there, that the administration was no longer interested in arresting the people who ran drug boats. He used 5 words: just sink the boats. That was the new doctrine, and by September, they would be doing exactly that. But before we get to the boats, we need to talk about a ghost. Every American officer planning the cartel war today has one operation pinned above his desk. Not Iraq, not Afghanistan. A jungle hunt that ended on a rooftop in Colombia 33 years ago, July 22, 1992. Pablo Escobar, the head of the Medellin cartel, the man who had at one point been responsible for 80% of the cocaine in America, walked out of a luxury prison he'd built for himself called La Catedral. He just walked out. The Colombian government had let him build it on a mountainside with a soccer field, a discotheque, a waterfall. When they tried to move him to a real prison, he simply left. That escape kicked off the most aggressive manhunt in American history. A U.S. Army signals intelligence unit called Centra Spike, part of the secret organization that's been called Task Force Orange. The activity, ISA, set up shop on the 5th floor of the American Embassy in Bogota. They flew modified Beechcraft airplanes with antennas hidden inside the wings. The wings were 6 inches longer than they were supposed to be, just to fit the gear. According to Mark Bowden's book, Killing Pablo, that gear could pinpoint a single mobile phone call to within 100 meters. The intelligence got fed to a Colombian unit called the Search Block, and the Search Block got trained on a base outside Talamida by a 16-man rotation of American operators from the Army's most secretive direct action force, Delta Force. Their commanders were two men whose names mean a lot inside the special operations community, Jerry Boykin and Gary Harrell. Officially, they weren't supposed to be on raids. Officially, they advised. Unofficially, Bowden's reporting, and decades of leaks since, suggest Delta operators kept finding ways onto missions. December 2, 1993, Pablo Escobar made a long phone call to his teenage son. Centra Spike fixed his location to a row house in the Los Olivos neighborhood of Medellin. Search block swarmed the house. Pablo ran for the rooftop. He got shot dead on a stretch of orange tile, barefoot, with one round behind his ear. Whether the killing shot came from a Colombian rifle, from Pablo's own hand, or, as a few pages of Bowden's book quietly hint, from a Delta sniper, no one will ever say. That was the original blueprint. American eyes in the sky, American operators in the shadows, a foreign partner force pulling the trigger, plausible deniability all the way up. In 2025, that blueprint got dusted off, and it got scaled up.
I will direct our government to use the full and immense power of federal and state law enforcement to eliminate the presence of all foreign gangs and criminal networks.
The reason why this is a conference with military leadership and not a conference of lawyers is because these organizations can only be defeated with military power.
The 2025 version goes by a few names: Inside Southcom and Northcom. They call it the Counter Cartel Mission. Inside CIA, it's a presidential finding. To every else, it's just a war the United States is fighting without telling anyone it's fighting. February 18th, 2025. The New York Times and CNN dropped the same story within hours of each other. The CIA is flying MQ-9 Reaper drones, the same airframe that killed Qasem Soleimani in Baghdad, the same airframe that killed bin Laden's successor in Kabul, deep into Mexican airspace. Officially, the drones aren't armed. Officially, they're just looking. They're flying over the Sierra Madre Mountains hunting fentanyl labs. Because here's the technical detail that mattered most in those reports: fentanyl labs leak chemicals into the air that show up clear as day on the right sensors. But CNN added a sentence that almost nobody noticed at the time. The flights had been notified to Congress under the special category Congress reserves for new covert programs the agency intends to conceal or deny. In other words, the U.S. government was officially telling Congress these flights might never officially exist. By November, NBC News was reporting that detailed planning was underway for kinetic strikes, combining CIA Reapers and Army Gray Eagle drones against fentanyl labs and high-value cartel figures inside Mexico. Strikes inside Mexico, without the Mexican government's permission. That's where it gets dangerous. Because the Mexican president, Claudia Sheinbaum, was clear about what she would tolerate. So the Trump administration adapted. If they couldn't strike inside Mexico, they could put their best people on the ground, next to Mexico's best people, and let the Mexicans pull the trigger. February 17, 2025. 11 members of the U.S. Army's 7th Special Forces Group, the Green Berets historically responsible for Latin America, landed at a Mexican naval base in Campeche, fully armed, aboard a C-130. They spent 6 weeks training Mexico's elite naval marine unit, the Fuerza Especial de Reacción, the same unit that had captured El Chapo in 2016. Then in January 2026, U.S. Northern Command stood up something called the Joint Interagency Task Force Counter Cartel, headquartered in southern Arizona. Brigadier General Maurizio Calabresi in command. Calabresi told Reuters his task force was modeled on the same targeting machinery that hunted Al-Qaeda and ISIS. Then he added a chilling line.
In terms of sheer size, the drug cartel threat was perhaps even larger.
Hundreds of senior leaders, 250,000 armed contractors. But every covert war has a cost. And in April 2026, the cost showed up in the worst possible way. A Mexican federal convoy was returning from destroying clandestine drug labs in the mountains of Chihuahua. The convoy crashed. 2 Mexican investigators died, and 2 Americans died with them. The Associated Press confirmed it days later, on April 22nd. The 2 dead Americans were CIA officers. President Scheinbaum, who had been blindsided by the deaths, told reporters in a tense press conference, "There cannot be agents from any U.S. government institution operating in the Mexican field." She opened sanctions proceedings against the state of Chihuahua's officials. The cover was blown. CIA officers weren't just analysts in Mexico City. They were riding on raids.
We're here to announce a landmark victory for the Department of Justice, our law enforcement partners, and the United States of America. El Mayo will spend the rest of his life behind bars.
On July 25, 2024, 6 months before Trump even took office, Ismael El Mayo Zambada Garcia, the 76-year-old godfather of the entire Sinaloa Federation, the man who had run Mexico's biggest cartel for 3 decades without ever spending a single day in custody, the man who outlasted El Chapo himself, touched down at a small airport near El Paso, Texas, and walked straight into the arms of American agents. He didn't come willingly, according to Mayo's lawyer Frank Perez, and later confirmed in part by the U.S. ambassador to Mexico. What happened was this. El Chapo's son, Joaquin Guzman Lopez, lured the old man to what was supposed to be a real estate meeting near Culiacan. When Mayo arrived, he was ambushed, bound, stuffed onto a small plane, flown across the border, handed over. The most powerful drug lord in the Western Hemisphere had been kidnapped by his own godson and gift-wrapped to the DEA. For 6 weeks, Sinaloa held its breath. Then, on September 9, 2024, Mayo's son Mayito Flaco gave the order. Synchronized strikes across the state. The Sinaloa Federation, the cartel that had held together since the late 1980s, had just split into 2 armies. Los Chapitos, the 4 sons of El Chapo, on one side, La Mayatza, the loyalists of the old man, on the other. By August 2025, CNN's analysis of state and federal data showed Sinaloa's homicide rate had risen by more than 400% since Mayo's capture. By the end of that year, Latin Times put the cumulative death toll at roughly 2,000. Decapitated bodies hung from bridges in Culiacan. Independence Day celebrations were canceled. A single Sunday, August 10, 2025, saw 17 people killed in Sinaloa, 1 every 85 minutes. While the Sinaloa Fedor, Ashen was tearing itself apart. The Cartel Jalisco Nueva Generación, CJNG, was getting bolder. Its leader, Nemesio Oseguera Cervantes, the man known as El Mencho, had been the most wanted man in Mexico for over a decade. The State Department had raised the bounty on him to $15 million in December 2024. He had survived everything: helicopter ambushes, cartel rivalries, 2 near misses by Mexican Marines, diabetes, kidney disease. Death itself seemed to have given up on him until February 22, 2026.
Well, developing tonight, chaos in Mexico after one of the most wanted cartel leaders in the country was killed in a military operation.
The Mexican Army's elite Fuerza Especial de Reacción, the same unit the Green Berets had been training, cornered El Mencho at a property in the rural municipality of Tapalpa, in his home state of Jalisco. 8 CJNG fighters died in the gun battle. El Mencho was wounded badly enough that he bled out before they could fly him to Mexico City. The Mexican government acknowledged U.S. intelligence support. The intercept later identified the specific node, the Joint Interagency Task Force Counter-Cartel that had been stood up just 6 weeks earlier in Arizona. This was the model: American eyes, American intelligence, Mexican boots, Mexican triggers. CJNG's response was apocalyptic. Within 72 hours, the cartel set off 252 violent incidents across 20 Mexican states. 25 National Guard troops killed in 6 firefights, burning buses across the highways from Baja California to Tamaulipas. Text messages going out to entire towns warning people to stay indoors. Mencho is here to stay. Within weeks, his stepson, Juan Carlos Valencia Gonzalez, a U.S. citizen, of all things nicknamed El Pelon, had taken control of the cartel. Dictate 1 head, 2 grow back. Same problem the United States had with Pablo Escobar in 1993. Same problem they have today, but by then, the war had already moved out to sea. Mexico was a war fought through fiber optic cables and proxies. The Caribbean was a war America could put on television. Which brings us back to that boat, the one we started with. September 2nd, 2025. A small speedboat leaves a Venezuelan port, 11 men aboard. The next afternoon, a missile fired from either a U.S. Navy helicopter or an MQ-9 Reaper turns the boat into a fireball. Trump posted the footage himself on Truth Social. The caption was a single word in all capitals: beware. Asked at the press conference 4 days later, Secretary of State Marco Rubio summed up the new doctrine in a single sentence. Instead of interdicting it on the president's orders, we blew it up, and it'll happen again. It did, again, and again, and again. By December, U.S. Southern Command had carried out 22 strikes on 23 vessels, 87 dead. By May 2026, that number had passed 188. On November 13, 2025, the operation got a name: Operation Southern Spear, run by Joint Task Force Southern Spear under Southcom. The buildup behind it was the largest American military presence in the Caribbean since the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis. The aircraft carrier USS Gerald R. Ford, the amphibious group around the USS Iwo Jima, F-35s, P-8 surveillance planes, B-52 bombers flying out of Minot Air Force Base, 2 B-1 Lancers performing what the Pentagon delicately called a bomber attack demonstration within a few miles of the Venezuelan coast, 15,000 troops, Marine Raiders and Navy SEALs embarked on the amphibious ships, ready to go ashore on a moment's notice. But here's where the story turns dark. That very first strike, September 2nd, would haunt the Pentagon for years, because what the public saw on Trump's Twitter feed wasn't the whole video. According to reporting in the Washington Post on November 28, 2025, when that first missile destroyed the boat, 2 of the 11 men aboard survived the initial blast. They were spotted on a live drone feed, clinging to the burning wreckage in the water. The Joint Special Operations Commander overseeing the strike, Admiral Frank Mitch Bradley, had a decision to make. He could have launched a rescue. He could have done nothing. Instead, he ordered a second missile. According to 2 people with direct knowledge of the operation, Admiral Bradley was acting on a verbal directive from Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth himself. The order, in 3 words, was this: kill everybody. The unit doing the targeting, sources confirmed to the Times, was SEAL Team 6. The 2 survivors were, in the Post's careful phrasing, blown apart in the water. A kill everybody order is a no-quarter order. It's specifically banned by the laws of armed conflict, by the Geneva Conventions, and by the United States War Crimes Act of 1996. Cardozo Law School professor Rebecca Ingber laid it out for Time magazine in a single sentence.
It is absolutely unlawful to order that there will be no survivors.
There is no actual armed conflict here, so this is murder. Hegseth, on Fox News a week later, didn't directly deny Ing the order. What he said instead was a kind of mission statement. If you are a narco-terrorist smuggling drugs in our hemisphere, we will treat you like we treat Al-Qaeda. Day or night, we will map your networks, track your people, hunt you down, and kill you. The Dutch and British governments, 2 of America's closest intelligence partners in the region, quietly stopped sharing maritime data with the U.S. by late 2025. They didn't trust how it would be used. But Operation Southern Spear was never really about the boats. The boats were the warm-up. The real target was always the man in the palace at the end of the runway.
This is a CBS News special report. I'm Carissa Lawson. President Trump just announced on social media that Venezuelan president, Nicolas Maduro, has been captured and flown out of the country.
Nicolas Maduro, the president of Venezuela, the man the United States Treasury had since 2025 identified as the head of the Cartel of the Suns, the alleged drug trafficking apparatus run by the Venezuelan military and senior government officials. In August 2025, the State Department had doubled the bounty on him to $50 million. In November, his cartel got the FTO designation. On October 15th, in the Oval Office, Trump publicly confirmed something the New York Times had broken hours earlier, that he had signed a presidential finding, the legal instrument that authorizes covert action by the CIA. Under that finding, the agency could conduct lethal operations in Venezuela, either alone or as part of a larger military operation. The CIA, NBC News reported, had inserted a small team into Venezuela as early as August 2025. By late fall, according to the Times, they had recruited a human source close enough to Maduro to relay details of his daily routine, what he ate, where he slept, which entrance he used. December 24th, 2025, Christmas Eve, a CIA drone strike destroyed a port facility outside Caracas allegedly used by Tren de Aragua. The dock was empty. No one was killed. It was a message. And 5 days later, on Fox News, Trump confirmed it. 2 nights ago, we knocked that out. But the message wasn't the operation. The operation was already in motion. 10:46 p.m. Eastern Time, January 2nd, 2026. In a situation room at Mar-a-Lago, surrounded by Rubio, Hegseth, CIA Director John Ratcliffe, Deputy Chief of Staff Stephen Miller, and Joint Chiefs Chairman General Dan Kane, Trump gave the go order. According to General Kane's briefing the next afternoon, the president's words were 5. Good luck and Godspeed. At 1:01 a.m. on January 3rd, helicopters from the 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment, the Night Stalkers, the same unit that had inserted SEAL Team 6 into Abbottabad to kill bin Laden in 2011, flew at 100 feet above the water through canyon routes north of Caracas, escorting them, jamming for them, blinding the Venezuelan air defenses for them, was a force General Kane described as more than 150 aircraft from 20 different bases on land and sea, F-22 Raptors, F-35 stealth fighters, F-18 Super Hornets, EA-18 Growlers for electronic warfare, E-2 Hawkeyes for command and control, B-1 bombers, numerous remotely piloted drones. U.S. Space Command, U.S. Cyber Command, the CIA, the NSA, and the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency all ran simultaneous cyber attacks on Venezuelan command networks. Trump later described it to the New York Post in his own peculiar phrasing. The discombobulator weapon. They pressed buttons and nothing worked. The interdiction force on the ground was Delta Force, the Army's first Special Forces Operational Detachment Delta, embedded with the FBI's hostage rescue team, because legally, this wasn't an assassination. It was an arrest. Maduro had been indicted in the Southern District of New York on narco-terrorism charges back in 2020. Delta and HRT were technically there to serve a warrant. Their target was a fortress-like compound at Fuerte Tiuna, the Venezuelan Ministry of Defense complex on the south side of Caracas. According to Trump on Fox and Friends the next morning, Delta had built, at a classified training site in the United States, a full-scale replica of the compound. Every wall, every safe room, every steel-reinforced panic chamber, just like the bin Laden replica that SEAL Team 6 had drilled on for months in 2011. When they hit the compound, Trump said, Maduro was already trying to get into his steel-walled panic room. He didn't make it. He was, in the president's phrasing, bum-rushed right so fast that he didn't get into that. Delta had brought massive blowtorches to cut through the steel if they'd needed to. They didn't. The force was in and out in roughly 2.5 hours. A single Night Stalker's helicopter took ground fire. The pilot was hit at least twice, but kept the bird in the air long enough to make it back to the carrier group. 0 American fatalities. The foreign body count was a different story. Cuba held a state funeral on January 16th for 32 of its own special operations personnel killed at Fort Tiuna, including senior officers from an elite unit called the Avis, Pas Negras, the Black Wasps, who had been protecting Maduro under a long-standing security agreement. Venezuelan Defense Minister Vladimir Padrino Lopez acknowledged 47 Venezuelan soldiers killed. By 4:32 p.m. Eastern Time, January 3rd, Nicolas Maduro was on the tarmac at Stewart Air National Guard Base in New York. He was photographed on the deck of the USS Iwo Jima, blindfolded, soundproof headphones over his ears, dressed in a gray Nike sweatsuit, his wife, Celia Flores, beside him. 2 days later, at his arraignment in federal court, Maduro stood before the judge and said one sentence in Spanish: "I am the president of Venezuela. I consider myself a prisoner of war. I was captured at my home in Caracas." Hegseth, addressing troops at Joint Base Andrews, called the operation the most sophisticated, most complicated, and most successful joint special operations raid of all time. And then the war kept going. By spring 2026, the war was bleeding into countries that hadn't even been on the list a year earlier. In Ecuador, where President Daniel Noboa had declared an internal armed conflict against 22 named criminal groups back in January 2024, U.S. Special Forces showed up in March 2026 for the first publicly acknowledged joint counter-narcotic ground operation on Ecuadorian soil. Helicopter-supported raids in Guayas, El Oro, Loja, targets connected to Los Lobos and an Albanian trafficking organization. A government source told The Intercept's Nick Terse,
"It wasn't going to be just boat strikes forever."
In Colombia, where Plan Colombia and the FARC peace deal had supposedly ended this kind of thing a decade ago, FARC dissidents shot down a Colombian Black Hawk on August 21, 2025, killing 13 police. By December, the United States had designated the Clan del Golfo a foreign terrorist organization. Colombia's left-wing president, Gustavo Petro, warned that he would take up arms if the United States tried inside his country what they had just tried inside Venezuela. In Mexico, Northcom's top-secret planning order, the one Ken Klippenstein reported on, the one giving SOCNorth the authority to strike inside Mexico, had a deadline of mid-September 2025. That deadline came and went. Whether the next one comes and goes the same way is the question that defines the next 12 months. But here's the part the Trump administration doesn't put in the press releases. The 2026 Atlanta Carolinas Drug Threat Assessment, an unclassified federal document, states it plainly.
Cocaine availability will continue an upward trend into 2026.
A former senior Justice Department official told NPR in November 2025, "All this strategy is doing is killing people, and the same amount of drugs is getting into the U.S. You didn't save anybody." CJNG detated, replaced inside 2 months. Sinaloa Federation broken, replaced by 2 factions killing each other and still pushing fentanyl. Maduro arrested, replaced by his own vice president, Delcy Rodriguez, while Trump promises that American oil companies will invest billions and billions in Venezuela. Pablo Escobar lay barefoot on a rooftop in 1993, shot dead by some combination of Colombian and possibly American hands. American officials called it the end of an era. A year later, the Cali cartel had taken over the entire global cocaine trade. 5 years later, the Mexican cartels had taken over from them. The lesson, if anyone is willing to learn it, is that you can kill a man. You cannot kill an enterprise. The CIA Reapers are still flying over Mexico. The Joint Interagency Task Force Counter-Cartel is still in southern Arizona. Delta Force is still rehearsing on a replica safe room somewhere in the American desert. Whoever is currently running CJNG, whoever is currently running the Chapitos, whoever is currently running Cartel of the Suns, they all know what's coming. The question is, what comes after? Because if centrist Spike taught the United States anything in 1993, it taught it that the man can always be killed. It just never taught it how to kill the thing that made the man in the first place.